Today I'm doing a final review on WorldKiller. WorldKiller was a two-player space war game that appeared in Ares magazine issue number 1 in 1980 and then was also released as a boxed game. This game was the reason that I started posting YouTube videos. This game was the first punch counter style war game that I ever tried to play. This was the first multiplayer game that I ever tried to play solitaire. WorldKiller, in a lot of ways, was a springboard into a hobby that I now really enjoy, which is researching and learning old games from the 80s, but also modifying them and hacking them and kit bashing them into new things. And I'm interested in the intersection between some of these elegant older rule sets and mechanics and some of the more modern approaches to bookkeeping. WorldKiller is a game of planetary assault designed for two players. One player plays the planetary defenders, whose ultimate goal is to destroy all the intruders before the intruders destroy the planet. This is what a typical setup might look like. First, the planetary defenders set up their starting units anywhere outside of the intruder setup zone. And then after they set up their units, the intruder sets up their units. There are only a handful of actions that you can take each turn. You can jump, attack, pop, which is basically jumping and attacking, or attacking and then jumping. But you take damage if you pop to simulate the extra stress on your ship. And you can repair. So you can basically just stay put and recover damage to your effective defense rating. And then each side has a special ability. The intruders have the ability to stretch. They stay inactive for that turn, and if they stretch for 2 turns, their jump range increases to 6 no matter what their original jump range was. And if they stretch for 3 turns, they can literally jump to any legal space on the board. The planetary defenders get a +1 defense bonus if they are adjacent to a friendly unit, the buddy system, if you will. Now, they can only get up to a +2, so it only really benefits any one unit to have 2 adjacent units. The Outrider orbital fortresses are not allowed to move. They are stationary. And the planet itself has 3 shields. Each shield has a defense of 5, and the intruder has to destroy all 3 shields. When the last shield is destroyed, the planet is destroyed. The intruders win the game if they destroy the planet. That's all they have to do. And they only have to have 1 surviving ship. And then the defenders win if they are able to destroy all the intruders, or if after 20 turns, their combined attack strength is twice as much as the combined attack strength of the intruders. These are just damage markers, so as units take damage, you can put damage markers next to them or under them. And then there are extra units, there are optional units, there are missile cruisers that can fire missiles. There's also a reinforcement scenario where after turn 13, you start rolling to see if reinforcements arrive. There are several different reinforcement units that will show up for the planetary defenders. And then there are reinforcements that will show up for the intruders on the following turn. The planetary defenders also have a unit called the Blitz Rider, and it's an optional unit. 1 Blitz Rider can be deployed from each orbital fortress, and they have the ability of suicide diving into intruder ships. They're kind of like missiles in that respect. And they can also pop attack without that damage if they're jumping half or less than half of their available jump range. So there's all these like subtle mechanics that add a little bit of spice to the game. But all in all, the gameplay is very, very simple. There's really only like 5 rules. The entire rule set for this game is only 4 pages long. But now for the elephant in the room, the one mechanic that makes this game unique and unlike any other game is this map. The game map is divided into cubes, and each cube represents 10,000 kilometer cube of space. And so this map is, 12 cubes on this dimension, 8 cubes on this dimension, but then also 7 cubes high. This unit is placed on the +3, which means he's all the way at the top of this stack of 7 cubes. And this unit is at -3, which means he's all the way at the bottom. So these two units are separated in vertical space by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cubes. So this unit to this unit is the same distance apart as these two units are from each other. And once you have like a dozen units flying around this map and they're all shifting, it can get really mind-boggling to keep track of. Whenever ships move in this three-dimensional space, you have to look at the true distance table. So, or let's say a unit wants to move 2 units this direction, 1 unit this direction, and then up 2 units. So it'd be like 2, 1, 2. And so here you'd have to go like, okay, there's a 2, 1, 2. So true distance is 3. So anytime you move, you have to use the true distance table. And that's true for attacks too. Anytime you want to attack, you have to use the true distance table to figure out if your weapon systems are within range of the target. So that becomes a pretty big part of the game, and that's also what makes this war game different than any of the other war games that I've tried to play. Now, combat is actually pretty simple. I love the combat system. You basically just take the defense strength of the defender, so in this case it would be 4, minus the attack strength of the attacker, minus 3, so that's a 1. There's a 1 modifier on defense, so then you just roll the die for the attacker, which is 3. You subtract the defense modifier, which is 1, so the attacker does 2 damage to the defender. Then you just throw down a 2 damage marker on the defender. One of the bookkeeping caveats is that the printed defense rating is just the initial defense rating, but the effective defense rating is what you'll be using, and it's always derived by subtracting half the damage from the initial defense rating. So if he were going to be attacked, his defense rating is no longer 4. It's 4 minus half of the damage, so 4 minus 1 is 3. But that's basically how combat works. It's very simple. A lot of the stats are just kind of derived from other stats like damage. And then once the amount of damage that you've incurred equals your attack strength or is greater than your attack strength, then you can no longer attack. So that's the other thing you have to kind of keep track of is my ship even able to attack right now? Now, I've played this game several times now, maybe 8 or 9 times at this point. There seems to be like 2 basic strategies that the defenders can use. One is stay tight around the planet, don't go anywhere, protect the planet at all costs, and don't try to chase the intruders down because the intruders are faster, and just use the adjacency bonus as much as humanly possible. The other strategy is to deploy as many of your units to the front line as possible so that immediately when the game starts, don't give the intruders an opportunity to stretch and attack them outright. And I've played it both ways, but as the intruders, I've had the most luck when I actually can stretch long enough to pop directly within range of the planet. I think where I landed with the strategy is if the intruders do not use their special stretch ability, they stand a great chance of losing. Like they really have to utilize their special skill to win the game. And the defenders, same situation. If they don't take advantage of the adjacency bonus and use the buddy system, they stand a much greater chance of losing. I read one review that was talking about how there is a game-breaking stat, the Dominators, because they have a longer attack range than the orbital fortresses, so they can actually stay just outside of range of the orbital fortresses and pick them off. It sounds like if you were really willing to take your time, the intruders could always win. I've never actually tried that strategy, but I think what I love about this game, I love the asymmetry between the two different sides. On the intruder side, you've got the stretching, which is really interesting, and then you can hyper jump to anywhere on the board. On the planetary defender side, you have the adjacency defense bonus. I love that. I love the simplicity of the combat. I like the theme. There's some narrative text in the rules that actually adds a lot of flavor. These ships could have been present in the actual battle had the Aken stripped their home system defenses. There's flavor text sprinkled throughout. There's a whole description of the fragile piece that existed, and then the attack on Green Dream in 3022-039 at 1755 hours, Sector 3 Standard Time. There actually is a story to this game. And then I'd say there are only two things about the game that I'm not crazy about. One, unfortunately, is the three-dimensional map. I do find trying to visualize the three-dimensional space on this two-dimensional grid and using the true distance table to look up distances between various cubes in this 3D space every single time you move a ship and every single time you attack can get very cumbersome and kind of take me out of the game. Now, over time, you sort of memorize the true distance table. It's not that crazy. Still, there's just the mental overhead of just constantly trying to visualize, like, this whole chase scene is actually happening on the vertical axis. The only other thing is the constantly deriving the effective defense by, like, halving the damage and subtracting that from the initial defense strength. The math is simple, it's easy arithmetic, but you're doing it for every single unit, every single combat, every single turn. So you're doing it dozens of times. Let's say you wanted to line up your fleet vertically. You could have a situation that actually looked kind of like this. And these ships are actually spread out just like these, but they're spread out vertically, and so you end up with like piles of counters. And then if each one of those ships has damage counters on it, like, forget about it. I think where I was left with this game is like, wow, I love the simple mechanics. I love the jumping, stretching, popping, attacking, repairing. All that is super cool, but there's just logistical issues with the map. It's a very clean, elegant system, but there's just a lot of mental gymnastics that are occurring all the time. Of the 16 Ares magazine games that I played or attempted to play, or at least read the rules and decided not to play, I pulled out 8 of those games as games that I actually liked and would play again, and this was one of them. So even though I have some gripes about this game, it's a game that I did thoroughly enjoy, and it's a game that I did end up playing multiple times, and it is a game that I will definitely play again. Pulling this game apart and trying to figure out exactly what bugged me about it led me to introspecting about ways to fix it. How easy would it be to modify this game and turn it into a game that I didn't have any problems with? And so that led me to try to tackle the first big issue, which was the map. So I ended up redesigning the map to see if that would solve my problems. And this was the solution I came up with. I basically took the 7 Z depths and separated them out into their own cells. And so they're never overlapping. And if you want to go from like the -3 Z depth to the +3, you basically would just go like that. It just provides a little more of a foothold for visualizing the three-dimensional space, and it gives the board and the game a lot more room to breathe. I played on this map a few times, and I would say in general, I would choose this map over this map. I tried to play on this map after I'd played on this map a few times, and I really just cannot play on this map anymore. So I like the look of this one better. I think visually this is more appealing and more like interesting, but this one's a lot more functional. I spent a lot of time just sort of fantasizing about how cool this game would be if there were dials. And then I was like, well, if there were actual dials, what if it was like a minis game? I've seen minis games where the minis have dials. And then I started sort of fantasizing and visualizing this game as like a minis game. And so this is what I came up with. I went with a hex map, two-dimensional hex map, got rid of the three-dimensional layers, and I created a standee with a dial that automatically updates the effective defense strength and attack strength with each damage. So here, this WorldKiller has 0 damage, so he has a defense of 6 and an attack of 3. He has a weapon range of 3 and a jump range of 3, and it's all right here on the dial. So here I've moved the dial. He now has 3 damage, His effective defense is only 5 now, and he can no longer attack because his damage is equal to his initial attack strength. So there's no mental bookkeeping at all. All the bookkeeping is done right on the dial. All the math is done by the dial. You still do the fun part, which is roll the die and subtract the defense modifier from the roll. So there's still a little bit of fun math related to combat, but all the mental bookkeeping and gymnastics is no longer a thing. And then the last thing I did was I created this little switch so that after a unit has moved, you can just flip the switch. And so on turn 1, you would flip all the switches to the right as the units move. And then on turn 2, you flip all the switches back to the left. It's just an easy way to keep track of which units have moved and which units haven't. The game pretty much plays almost identically to the original game. I made a few modifications. I put the planet in the center of the game map, and I made 4 possible points of entry for the intruders. And so after the planetary defender sets up his units, the intruder can decide like where he wants to set his units up. Or if you're playing solitaire, you can actually roll and randomly have the intruders show up. So the planetary defenders sort of have to figure out like how they want to focus their forces to prepare for a possible invasion from any direction. And then the other thing that I changed was instead of 4 orbital fortresses, there are only 3, because it just made a little more sense on this hex map to have 3 instead of 4. But at the end of each turn, each orbital fortress moves 1 hex around the orbital path of the planet, and it's just an involuntary action that occurs every turn. So there's kind of a weird fun mechanic going on with the orbital fortresses. And because there's only 3 orbital fortresses, there's only 3 Blitz Riders for the Blitz Rider variant of the game. For the planetary shield, I gave the planet its own dial, and it basically has 6 initial defense, and its effective defense works just like the ships. So it basically would take 12 damage to destroy the planetary shield and destroy the planet. As an experiment, I created a moon, and I wasn't really sure how to use the moon, and I ended up using the moon as a turn counter. The other thing I worked pretty hard on was staying true to the original art. So here we have the WorldKiller, and what I really wanted to do was create these 3D ships that sort of harkened back to the original. So in this instance, the original WorldKillers were just a line with a dot. So I turned the line into these huge hyperdrives that are like, a kilometer long. And then the dot becomes the sort of war machine / habitat for the intruders. And I just went through and did that for every ship. The Dominators were originally like, a line with 2 dots. That's my Dominator design. And I ended up going with like labels for all the ships just to give it a little more pizzazz. For missiles, I did change the missile design a little bit. I thought torpedoes that hyperjumped were kind of silly, so I made my missiles more like these giant spiked mines that can hyperjump. The missile cruisers kind of have their own thing going on. I once again tried to stay true to the original design of the missile cruisers. And then we have all the familiars. We've got the space trains, the K-wagons, the V-dusters. But the real question is, how did this play, and did it solve all the problems? I would say that I definitely prefer the 2D map over the 3D map, and I definitely prefer the hex map over the square map. So I like the map a lot better. I love the fact that the dials keep track of all the bookkeeping, but the one thing I did not anticipate is that the dials are kind of fidgety. To rotate the dial, you have to pick the ship up. And there were several times where I picked the ship up, rotated the dial, but then couldn't remember where the ship was to begin with. Just little things like that. The little turn switch to indicate whether a ship has gone yet or not. And when you turn the damage dial, sometimes that turns, and then you kind of get a little messed up. So it's like it sort of works better, but it's its own type of cantankerous. And when there are battles going on, you end up with like pretty crowded space still. You're still sort of like trying to get this unit out of this crowd and then change the dial and then slip it back in, and you're still cranking your neck to try to look at the numbers on the dial. So I thought this would be a perfect solution to all the problems of the game, but it turns out that it's kind of a pseudo solution, and it kind of creates its own set of problems, and it kind of creates its own set of like juggling assets around and trying to get to something that's hard to reach. It's not quite as perfect of a solution as I thought it would be. I think there's a simple elegance to these punch counter war games. I think there is sort of a theater of the mind. A lot of the majesty and the visuals take place in the minds of the player, whereas here it's sort of fully articulated and you kind of get, the plastic tells you what to think and how to look at it. So I don't know. It's kind of give and take. I don't really like this more than I like this. I like them both, and I respect what this version of the game did. And I think this was just kind of a really fun experiment. It gave me a chance to get out my 3D printer and dust off my 3D printing skills and my 3D modeling skills. It gave me a chance to try to tackle some design challenges and just see if I can solve issues. I spend a lot of time sitting around like talking shit about games and saying like, oh, well, they should do it this way and that way. But like, how often do we really put our money where our mouth is and literally try to like solve problems that we have with games? And so I think that's the one thing I got from this was like I really did go the whole 9 yards and try to solve every single problem that I had with WorldKiller and make it like the perfect entry level war game. And I think on some levels it succeeded, and on some level it's like, the simplicity of this really works too. So it's a mixed bag. It's not a binary thing. Now, I played this game 3 times solo. I actually talked my wife into playing this game with me last night, and she wanted to play the planetary defense, and she's not a war gamer. She's a lawyer. So she likes rules and she loves to win, but she doesn't really care for war games. So she chose the planetary defenders because she's a defense attorney. And once I told her about the adjacency bonus, she's like, "Oh yeah, joint defense group, got it." And she destroyed me. She really embraced the notion of adjacency, and she kept all of her ships adjacent to other ships all the time, and she was getting that defense bonus all the time. I would say if you have any interest at all in vintage war games from the late 1970s, early 1980s, if you have any interest at all in science fiction, space combat, I highly recommend. And especially if you like simple games that can be played in under an hour. I think the game that my wife and I played last night took about an hour. So if you're interested in war games, but you want to keep it simple and you don't have a lot of time, I think WorldKiller is a great game to cut your teeth on. I think it's a great introduction to wargaming.